Hello, my name's Richard Forbes, the Head of Corporate Affairs at the Mulloon Institute, and welcome to all of you from all parts of Australia to this special event, the second annual Tony Coote Memorial Lecture. Before we begin, we thought we'd give you an overview of the work of the Institute through this short video.
We're regenerating the environment. This ancient landscape has all the answers that we need for us to go forward. And it's important to the social well-being of communities and of the nation.
I think what we're looking at here is the future of water management on Australian farms. And with the evidence that's now being gathered by the Institute, I think we'll prove it. This is so important. We need it. You know, our country needs it, and farmers need it.
The Mulloon Institute supports the long-term sustainable growth of Australian agriculture.
Less rainfall and more regular droughts are impacting Australia's food and water security and environment. So we need to support our farmers to adapt. Maloon is focused on creating a more resilient and profitable landscape where agriculture and environment are working in unison. The Mulloon Institute's catchment and landscape rehydration work has been acknowledged globally for bringing degraded landscapes back to life, and in doing so, helping farmers be more resilient and productive.
We've been selected by the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Council as one of only 5 global projects to be a demonstrator of how environmental repair can assist agriculture into the future.
We partner with global leaders in regenerative land management practices and agricultural research. We know that healthy soil is essential for the production of nutrient-dense food and healthy ecosystems. Our story began not so long ago when the Mulloon Institute began working with local farmers on an entire catchment scale project in southern New South Wales.
The Mulloon Institute has a science advisory committee which meets on a regular basis, and it is in fact a research project monitoring and benchmarking what we're doing as well, so as we can determine the change that is going to occur.
And the results have been extraordinary. A combination of rehydrated landscapes, increased vegetation cover, grazing management and working with the natural ecosystem has seen a remarkable turnaround on the floodplain.
If you just think about the water holding capacity of the floodplain here at the home farm, it's about 100 hectares. It will hold in the floodplain probably about 3,000 megalitres of water. The lower Maloon floodplain is about 1,000 hectares, so it's 10 times larger than the home farm floodplain. There is 1 million kilometres of incised valley floor in Australia. If you multiply that water banking capacity across the whole of Australia, and all of a sudden you're holding on to an almost incalculable amount of water that is going to continue to keep our ecosystems alive and our agriculture alive. The landholders couldn't be happier with the results. All the time I get inquiries now from communities from all over Australia saying we want to do catchment scale projects in the same way as Maloon is doing its projects.
They're making us all more knowledgeable about what actually happens with landscape. It's definitely improved the value of our property.
All the way along the whole catchment it has benefited, and it will have generations, I hope, ahead of us that will feel the benefit from the work that's been done by the Mulloon Institute.
We're very interested in better hydration for these river flats, and because while we could get more pasture for the cattle, with better hydration, we can also look at other alternatives, and we can look at other more intensive forms of agriculture which will make the farm more profitable than it is. I think we're now creating the conditions here that will support more wildlife as well as provide the farm with what it needs. I think what we're looking at here is the future of water management on Australian farms. And with the evidence that's now being gathered by the Institute, I think we'll prove it.
You know, we've now been working quite solidly up in North Queensland, and in relation to the Barrier Reef, where sediment flow is a major problem, and farmers up in there wanted to do something about it, and we've been able to demonstrate to them how they can improve their agriculture as well as improving and limiting sediment flow into the Barrier Reef.
The Mulloon Institute is unique in that we own 2 properties known as living laboratories that enable scientists to continually refine their research. While the work at the Mulloon Institute continues, the issue of changing climatic conditions and the need for a more resilient agricultural sector is on the political radar.
We see ourselves as probably we're quite an innovator, and now getting that federal government endorsement, that was a great plus. I would like to see when government are looking at policy in this area, one of the first people they'll come to are the Mulloon Institute to help advise and help develop those policies.
Certainly the regeneration that is going on here, this needs to be replicated right around our nation.
This is about doing what we need to do straight away, and it's about doing what we need to do long term, and to have that long-term vision and plan like Tony did, to ensure that we've got the right practices and we've got the right infrastructure and the right support going right around rural and regional Australia.
The landscape rehydration research is ongoing, as is the advocacy work and education and training of farmers, working together to support agriculture and the environment. The legacy of Tony Coote, our founder, and his vision for the Mulloon Institute will live on. By supporting the Mulloon Institute, you are supporting the future of the Australian environment and agriculture.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce the chairman of the Mulloon Institute, the Honourable Gary Nairn, AO, who will welcome our guest speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. And thank you all for participating in this year's Tony Coote AM Memorial Lecture virtually. Hopefully it'll be back to normal next year when we can meet in person as we did last year for the inaugural lecture. But despite the COVID restrictions, we've been able to ensure this year's lecture is delivered by one of the most eminent persons in our field of interest, Allan Savory. Allan is Zimbabwean born, and his early career was as a research biologist, game ranger and farmer. In the 1960s, he made a significant breakthrough in understanding what was causing degradation and desertification of the world's grassland ecosystems. And as a resource management consultant, worked with numerous managers on 4 continents to develop sustainable solutions. He served as a Member of Parliament in opposition, and in 1979, near the end of the Zimbabwe Civil War, was exiled and immigrated to the USA. In 1992, back in Zimbabwe, with his wife, Jodie Butterfield, formed the Africa Centre for Holistic Management. In 2009, they founded the Savory Institute. Amongst his many international awards is the 2003 Australian International Banksia Award. And I quote, "For the person or organisation doing the most for the environment on a global scale," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, as chairman of the Mulloon Institute, it gives me great pleasure to ask Allan Savory to deliver the 2020 Tony Coote AM Memorial Lecture.
I wish to thank the Mulloon Institute and you, Gary, for inviting me to present this year's Memorial Lecture as a tribute to Tony. Following last year's oration by your former Governor-General, Major General Michael Jeffrey. Now, I intend to talk about regenerative agriculture, but at a depth that society could not relate to before the pandemic, but might now be able to do so. Australians and all nations face grave dangers from desertification, mega fires, and climate change that are fueling one another. The fate of your grandchildren, like frogs in slowly boiled water, is in the hands of the currently governing generation more than any time in the history of the world. So serious is this situation that we have young people in Australia and elsewhere pleading and demanding action from politicians or world leaders. Behaviour unheard of in previous generations. But what action should your Prime Minister take? What action should the leaders of all nations take? Because these dangers are global. This is the subject of my lecture today, because I feel it is fitting to Tony's memory, and frankly, it's the most profoundly important subject that we should all be talking about. Whether they are political or religious, world leaders depend on scientific advisors. So what sort of advice is offered to political leaders? Scientific experts have been gathering in thousands of meetings and conferences. These include 25 climate conferences, COP1 to 25. These conferences, vital to the future of humanity, have resulted basically in conflict, chaos, and confusion, mostly around greenhouse gases from fossil fuels. Despite the gravity, there's been little, if any, discussion about desertification or even about agriculture playing a greater and more lasting role in megafires and climate change, I believe, even than fossil fuels. Frankly, I don't believe your Prime Minister or any politician anywhere is getting sound advice about what to do in response to these demands for action. They are in the same position that I was in 50 years ago when I was president of a political party in Parliament. Now, having grappled with the issue of environmental degradation for so long, I intend in this lecture to talk about what I've learned. I need to tell some of my personal story because it is unique, as you will learn, and it has great bearing on the dangers that we face. As a starting point, I'm going to take it as an unarguable truth that if we do not address the cause of a problem, we cannot solve it. So what is the cause of climate change? With that in mind, if we look at the many climate conferences, we see that the same scientists, wallowing in confusion, have acknowledged the cause of climate change. However, we also see that they failed to recognize that they had done so. Because to succeed, politicians have to address the cause, I intend to focus on that alone and how it could be addressed. For thousands of years, we knew that we were causing desertification because of the way we managed livestock. But with climate change, we've been through years of denial and reluctance to accept that humans could be causing it. However, recently, the vast majority of scientists have acknowledged that we, humans, are causing climate change. Think about it for a moment. That acknowledgement that we are causing climate change means the cause is management. There is no other possible interpretation. Despite now knowing that management is the cause of climate change, most of society, media, and our institutions continue to blame livestock, coal, and oil per se. Livestock, coal, and oil are resources. While like all resources, they're involved, it is only the management of such resources that results in desertification, fires, climate change. There is a vast difference between our management actions that we debate and argue over endlessly at climate and other conferences, and how, when we are managing, we decide those many actions. About management, there is no debate at all in any conferences. When over 60 years ago, I recognized that our management of the land was causing great damage, even in wild parts of Africa, we did not have today's soundbite attention span. We didn't have the buzzwords, desertification, climate change. And science, at least for me, in the remote bush in Africa, was largely a pencil, notebook, observation, deduction, and hours of thought and discussion around campfires. Science was not academia and peer-reviewed publications only. As far as I know, I was the first young biologist recruited into any game department in Africa. At the age of 16, I was ready to leave school and become a game ranger. But the minimum joining age was 25 years because of the dangers. An old ranger who knew me advised me to go to university and get older, and I did. Then the British colonial government the colonial office made an exception, and I joined at the age of 20 with a very lowly BS degree. A year later, I was thrown into deep water when I was promoted to a senior position responsible for 200 staff and managing the wildlife over an area approximately the size of the United Kingdom. My university training as an ecologist had taught me that burning grasslands was essential. Every year we burnt millions of hectares to provide a green flush for the animals and to keep the African savannas healthy. In fact, we managed the landscape with fire, much as your Aborigines did for thousands of years. Almost everywhere, I found that the environment was deteriorating, and it was affecting elephants' diets and movements and causing conflict with people. I simply could not connect what I was observing with soils, weather, or anything but our management. Frankly, I felt very incompetent. I felt inadequate and responsible as a kid with a bachelor's degree and everyone expecting me to know what to do about the degradation, and especially in areas that we intended to be future national parks. In about 1956, the famous British ecologist Frank Fraser-Darling was sent out by the British government to report on the situation in northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. Because I was in charge of management, as I said, over an area about the size of the UK, Fraser-Darling spent 6 weeks with me in the field conducting him around. Every night at our campfire, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, we discussed this inexplicable soil erosion and habitat deterioration that I was showing him. Both of us knew that habitat destruction was far more dangerous to wildlife than poaching. Frequently, I expressed my view that people like myself, as professional managers, were a major part of the problem because we did not know what we were doing. When we parted, after 6 wonderful weeks, still as friends, Fraser-Darling said to me, "Allan, you have only 2 choices ahead of you. You will either go back to university and publish papers and not worry about what happens, or you will go into politics." I swore blind that I would do neither of those things. 20 years later, in Scotland, I visited Sir Frank, as he had by now been knighted, and I reminded him of our discussion, and I sheepishly told him, "You were right. I am now president of a political party leading the opposition in Parliament." By force of circumstance, I had not only become a political leader, trying to put a stop to land degradation, but also, as an army officer, trying to end a bitter civil war, a war in which I fought for 20 years and commanded a tracker combat unit. So I spent literally thousands of hours of my life tracking down my fellow countrymen, and what a tragedy that was, but it turned out a blessing in the long term. Later, a South African, Lieberman, was to write a book tracking the origin of science. I believe he is correct, and science as we now know it began thousands of years ago, and it began with the incredible powers of observation, deduction, getting into the mind of the animal or human you're tracking when your life depends on it. Today, I know that my view is coloured by years of deep concern, first with trying to understand and then to solve why management by humans led to environmental degradation, and has throughout history. I lecture today from a position of no expertise on climate change. The solution I present could not have been discovered in any university or institute, nor in any one country, nor in any one profession, or by any one person. It required a particular set of circumstances that I was thrown into, beginning as a government biologist, but becoming an independent scholar, supporting my work and my family in every way I could, as a farmer, as a soldier, as a rancher, as a game rancher, as a politician, and then as an international consultant. And then finally, as a political exile, I was commissioned to train literally thousands of scientists and managers from American government agencies, universities, and the World Bank in the early 1980s. I do not give doomsday talks or lectures, so let's look at what I think could be done, based upon what many of us have learnt over the past 60 years. For simplicity, I will talk climate change, rather than keep repeating desertification and megafires, because they are one issue being caused by the same management entirely. Now, climate change is the problem politicians have to address, and the cause is management. Management occurs at two fundamental levels. As individuals, you or I can change the light bulbs or ride a bicycle to work. As individuals and families, we can and we do develop policies to prevent or deal with problems in our homes or in small communities. However, when management has to occur on a large scale, we can only do it through institutions or organizations and the policies they develop. That is the only way we can do it. And the developing of policies, as I learnt when president of a political party, is the main role of government. Governments rule through policies that become laws and regulations. Faced as your government is with the environmental degradation culminating in climate change, logically, all that your Prime Minister can do is to mobilise Australia to address the crisis with the nation solidly behind him. With the situation more profoundly dangerous than all the wars ever fought, have we any precedent? Yes, we do. Allied political leaders managed and won the Second World War by superb leadership, mobilizing and directing their armed services, corporations, universities, and scientific researchers under the best leaders they could engage to head every institution. Personal and institutional egos were largely swept aside, as were ineffective leaders of armies, corporations, research establishments, or any other institutions involved. Politicians even had to replace peacetime generals with others of a different mindset. While science played an enormous role, scientists did not manage the war cabinets of prime ministers, dictators, presidents. World leaders did. And in just the same manner, your Prime Minister, sooner or later, is going to have to lead you Australians. Now, if your Prime Minister, or any leader, world leader, is to mobilise to manage the crisis, more serious, as I said, than any wars ever fought, how might he or she do so? First, we need to look at what is wrong in our management and is causing climate change. To help you understand this, I need to explain the difference, the distinction between what we manage and what we make or produce. And I need to do this on a big picture. There are three things we manage: we manage humans, our lives, our families, our communities, our institutions. We manage nature. We manage economies. Three things. We do not make or produce organizations, nature, or economies. These we manage. Everything else that we do, we make or produce. From a toothbrush to space exploration vehicles, computers, etc., we produce food and fiber from nature. We make electricity and usable energy from nature, from coal, oil, nuclear, geothermal, moving water, wind and solar. And of course, we produce wonderful structures, cities, works of art and music. Now that we know management is causing climate change, we need to look at any differences that could be significant between the things we make and the things we manage. Everything that we make, without exception, requires technology in some form. Everything we make or produce ends or stops working if we stop making it, or a part is missing or breaks, if fuel runs out or a battery dies. Nothing that we make is self-organizing in system science definition. Everything we make is defined as a complicated system. Now, the three things that we manage are very different. They are self-organizing. Although they change and keep functioning if people die, or even if hundreds of species become extinct, and as I have learned, even when an entire economy and currency collapsed, as it did in my country, the people in the black market kept the country running. In system science, everything that we manage is defined as a complex system. Self-organizing defines complexity in this sense. With the things that we make, at least in the short term, everything appears well. Massive industrial production of food, ever more powerful weapons, mass entertainment, more comforts, better communications and transport. There seems to be no limit to what we make or produce. I can understand why physicist Stephen Hawking could believe that the future of humanity lies in colonizing space. And I can believe why some scientists believe that we can use technology to make our climate or geoengineer our climate. Now, when we look at the things we manage, we see a very different picture. One of escalating problems and catastrophes, like one tsunami after another. We can explore outer space, fly faster than sound, destroy a city in a flash, but we cannot put the simplest things right in our one and only home, our human habitat. If I take a simplest of examples, managing national parks to preserve nature's beauty and biodiversity, we couldn't take a simpler example. Around where I live, there are large national parks that are shocking examples of environmental destruction, biodiversity loss, and desertification contributing to climate change. Managed by governments and the world's large environmental organizations, no one can blame coal, oil, livestock, greed, corruption, or anything but management by the best of our scientists. If ever there was a greater case of dead canaries warning us that we are destroying our human habitat, I cannot imagine it. Whatever is wrong with management has to do with managing complexity, as defined in system science. Earlier, I said that we can manage on a large scale only through institutions. Now, institutions are themselves complex with wicked problems, almost impossible to solve as they are defined. Problems that don't exist with the things we make, where problems are capable of solutions relatively easily. One such institutional problem has not been solved since the days of Galileo, and now it is endangering humanity. No matter how caring, intelligent, or brilliant the people are in our institutions, institutions simply do not accept truly new knowledge that is opposed to human beliefs until the view of society begins to change. Until society sees common sense in new thinking, institutions oppose and ridicule any truly paradigm-shifting knowledge. So far, I have told you nothing new. Nothing I did not learn from history, social science, research, reading, and thousands of discussions with concerned people around dinner tables and campfires over half a century. At this point, I now need to start talking about new discoveries, insights that go against thousands of years of human belief. I need to talk about two totally new management insights that do not involve any technological discovery, no brilliant science, nothing of the sort. They are mundane and simple, and they do conflict with thousands of years of human belief. What are our beliefs about management? We believe that there are a great many ways of managing. University libraries and bookstores are full of authoritative books, and prestigious universities turn out thousands of management experts in many fields. I too once believed there were many ways of managing. In the mid-1960s, faced with trying to learn how to use livestock to reverse desertification, I had concluded that some form of planning process was essential, and it couldn't be done without developing one. Because the ways humans had managed livestock, every way they had led to desertification. Now, rather than reinvent the wheel, I solved that problem by using 300 years of European military experience. How had the military, the colleges of Europe, learnt to plan in immediate battlefield conditions, very complicated, constantly changing? What they had worked out for complicated, fast-changing situations, I simply adapted. I had to make minor changes to the concept and develop a grazing planning process. Now, that worked immediately, including in the successful international trials, and it spread to about 50 or more ranching properties over 5 countries in southern Africa where I was consulting. We were all excited about that. Then I became a political exile, unable to live in southern Africa, and all those properties, every one of them, began regressing in 1980. Something was missing. Something was wrong. Analyzing every case that I could, I realized the problem was me. I had solved how to address very complicated situations with animals and land, but not how to manage the social, cultural, institution, or human and ecological or economic complexity. So once more, in 1980, I began looking at management even more deeply, seeking clues and answers. In doing this, I realized that every way of managing, without any exception, had to culminate in the decision-making at some point. This was where things were going wrong, not with the planning of the animals and the grazing, but with the family or company decision-making affecting the business as a whole. And so I began to peel the onion, as I call it, peeling off one layer after another in all the various main ways of managing, till I got to the point at which actual decisions are made. And in every way that there is of managing, at the same point, decisions have to be made at some point. After all, management is really decision-making. Now, at that point, the core, where every human decision is made, I found that all management is identical. Regardless of what is being managed, how, when, or by whom, the actual decisions are made always in the same way. The core in human decision-making looks like this. We make decisions to achieve various objectives to meet some need, desire, or address a problem. Secondly, we use some tool. And third point, we make every decision on one or more of a great many factors. Those 3 points. That is the core at the center of all management by humans. It is almost childishly simple and obvious once we recognize it. Now, the actual one or more many factors that we make the decision on are things such as past experience, expert advice, research results, intuition, cost, profitability, cultural norms, emotion, fear, compromise, expediency, beliefs, political ideology, taboos, laws, regulations, and so on. Now, once we recognize this simple core, we see it everywhere, from managing our lives to the most sophisticated interdisciplinary scientific team, exploring space or developing any policy. And we recognize that it is how our ancestors made decisions from before they learnt to light fire. It is genetically embedded. At this point, we see that our universal belief of humans that there are many ways of managing becomes questionable, when all of them have the same core where the actual decisions are made. So let us now look and see if there is some flaw in this core that explains why we have such difficulty managing complexity, and I will begin with nature, which we have to manage. The present pandemic has created global awareness that a tiny virus can do more economic damage in a few months than was done during the Second World War, in which I grew up. 50 years ago, when I was struggling to understand, I drew heavily on the theory of General Jan Smuts, the Prime Minister of South Africa, who in 1926 wrote his book, Holism and Evolution. Einstein, who knew and understood Smuts, is alleged to have said he believed 2 constructs would have great impact on the world. One, of course, being his own theory of relativity, and the other Smuts's concept of holism. Nature, Smuts pointed out, functions in wholes and patterns, from atoms in his day to the universe. Smuts theorized about how from matter, eventually over time, consciousness and mind evolved. There are no parts or connections in nature, only wholes and patterns. Somehow, I gathered, complexity involves indivisible wholes and patterns. Now that is way too theoretical for most of us, and certainly for me. So I brought Smuts's thinking down to practical, simple reality by recognizing that in management, at any level, we are always dealing with an indivisible web of complexity, social, environmental, economic. Now, most economists do not recognize the fact that the only economy that can sustain us is one built on a foundation of the photosynthetic process. Reading the biography of a chairman of the US Federal Reserve Bank, I noted he only mentioned agriculture once Now, in Africa earlier, I worked with 2 American professors who were Fulbright scholars for 4 years, and other Americans were observing my work in the 1960s and 70s. And in the early 80s, as a political exile, I was commissioned by far-sighted officials in the US Department of Agriculture to put some 2,000 scientists and American Land Management Agency people, as well as from USAID, World Bank, and major universities, through a week of training over a 2-year period. I was training this large sample of professional people in the use of a new management framework that I was developing. Given this opportunity of 2 years of intense participation, enthusiastic contributions, and harsh academic criticism by probably the largest sample of professional people ever perhaps to have concentrated on managing complexity, that enabled me to realize where the main problem lay. We manage to improve our lives, and we're always dealing with this web of complexity, human, environmental, economic. However, with our hardwired decision-making core, we do not recognize that fact. That was where the problem lay. Now, even when politicians have a problem to address, and everybody knows it will have social, economic, and political consequences, they pull together the most sophisticated interdisciplinary team of scientists with all the necessary professions. What happens? That team develops policy based on all of their points of view in the context of that problem, be it drugs, terror, immigration, or noxious plants. Think of your own lives, personal or business. I doubt you will find many decisions that you did not make to meet some need, desire, or deal with a problem. And any rare decision not made for those reasons is still made in the same manner. Now, to improve our lives is an ideal context for our decisions. However, our lives, as we're now hearing, are indivisible from nature and economy, and we ignore that web of complexity at our peril. Through 2 years of intense discussions, seeking flaws in the logic or the science with the harshest of critics, it became apparent that we needed some concept to guide all management that tied our lives, our environment, and our economy together. A holistic context in which all management decisions can then be made. It was then that I and the American Interagency Committee with which I was working realized that reductionist management and policy development was universal. And I brought the word holistic into the decision-making framework that we were developing. The holistic context is a statement by the people responsible for management on how they want their lives to be, tied to their behavior and life-supporting environment, not as it is now, but as it will have to be if able to sustain future generations living similar lives, hundreds of years from now. There is no concept like this in any branch of science, religion, or philosophy. And that made it difficult indeed to learn what was missing and to develop it. There are guidelines or rules to developing the necessary holistic context in any situation, from the individual to a national level. Things such as absolutely no discussion at all about any present problem or poor state of the environment, no reference to any practices or what should be done. There can be no prejudice against any future action, no political ideology. In particular, there has to be total agreement without any compromise especially in situations of great conflict. Once the appropriate people in any management situation have developed their own holistic context, then management proceeds as normal. Essentially, and without disruption in any management situation, we simply go on about meeting our needs, our desires, or addressing problems. We open our minds to all science and other sources of knowledge, and we still make decisions exactly as we did on one or more of those many factors. However, and this point is important, where our needs, desires, or problems were both the reason and the context within which we made decisions, they are no longer. They will remain now the reason why we make any management decision, but we now do it in a holistic context. And we also now ensure that even our objectives, goals, missions, or visions are in that holistic context. All right, now let me leave that for a moment and let's look at a second flaw in our universal decision-making all managers use. I've talked about one flaw, explaining why it's difficult to manage complexity. Now I have to talk about another that makes it simply impossible to address desertification and mega fires and thus ultimately climate change, even if we had been able to manage complexity. Earlier I mentioned that we are a tool-using animal. We have to use a tool. Let me now return to that. When we manage nature, we apply our creativity, our money, and our labor through some tool. No one listening to me now can even drink water without using a tool unless you go to the nearest river and drink with your hands and your mouth. When I was commissioned to train those 2,000 professional people by the American government, I knew that every one of them believed that they had a great many tools at their disposal, and thus options to manage our environment or nature. Accordingly, I had everyone list every tool they had ever been taught or trained to use in any university, in any profession in the world, and also to list any tools they might ever have used in their private lives. Now, doing this, they came up with lists of hundreds of tools by those men and women. We then broke all of those tools down into categories. And doing this, it became clear to every one of us that we only had two tools. We had technology advancing and advancing and advancing from the Stone Age, from stones to modern marvels of technology, and we had fire. We also learned that we could categorize one other action as a tool if it was used positively, and that was the idea of resting the environment to let biodiversity recover. Commonly that's called conservation today. Now, as I discovered in the 1960s, desertification occurred only in seasonal rainfall environments, where chemical oxidation replaced biological decay in annually dying vegetation where there were too few animals, like most of Australia. Desertification did not occur where oxidation did not replace biological decay, no matter how old the vegetation and regardless of animals. To make that simple, the rainfall in London and Johannesburg is about the same. Around London, dead grass decays biologically, and desertification does not occur, no matter what you do. Around Johannesburg, dead grass mostly does not decay, but breaks down chemically by oxidation, and desertification occurs in the absence of adequate animals. A profound difference that we ecologists and scientists failed to spot until I observed it in the field and drew attention to it some 50 years ago. And in a 2013 TED Talk, viewed by millions of people, I explained why we have no option but to use livestock as a tool, without which it's simply not going to be possible to reverse desertification, playing as it does a major role in climate change. It is going to require millions more animals on the land to reverse desertification than we can even imagine today, after centuries of belief that too many animals cause desertification. Thankfully today, due to training thousands of people and the TED Talk going to over 7 million people, millions of people today are aware of things like capped soil and oxidation and are saying that we need to use livestock to mimic nature. So let me now wrap up. The cause of desertification, megafires and climate change is management. That, I believe, no reputable scientist would any longer dispute. Management by politicians and governments on a large scale is done through scientific experts, academics, lobbyists advising or pressuring politicians on policy. While politicians are surrounded by specialists and experts far more intelligent and knowledgeable than I am, I believe they are not surrounded by experts in how to manage complexity. And managing complexity is what political leaders and your Prime Minister have to do as they mobilize to act as is being demanded. I could leave it at that. But in view of the gravity and the problems we face, if you will indulge me, I will end my lecture in an unusual way. I would be negligent if I did not break with tradition and end with a recommendation based on everything I've learned in a long life devoted to finding solutions. The demand for action is going to increase. The conflict can only increase, as it has been doing all my life. No one is truly assisting world leaders by even suggesting how they might mobilize and manage the situation more dangerous than all wars ever fought. As a former president of a political party and member of parliament, I understand, I really do, why no prime minister or president can act decisively as our youth are demanding. With such thoughts in my mind, and knowing what I now know, what would I do if the responsibility stopped with me? What would I do if I was your Prime Minister, expected to act on a war footing, just as Allied leaders did to manage the Second World War? Let me explain what I would do as a way of making a recommendation. First, if I was your Prime Minister, I would carry on as usual. I would take no political risk. I would govern as Australians expect, developing policy as you do, on the basis of expert advice, lobbyist pressures, everything as normal. Now, while preparing this lecture, I heard on the BBC that Australian scientists are advising the use of fire to prevent megafires by burning inflammable material before it can accumulate and lead to megafires. But desertification, megafires, and climate change are inseparable. Using fire in this manner will, in the short term, decrease megafires. It'll be a band-aid. But in the long term, both desertification and climate change are likely to increase for two reasons. First, fire is a major factor in desertification and climate change. And second, this policy, as you now know, does not address the cause of climate change, and you have to address the cause for success. So, as your Prime Minister, if I were he, knowing this can only be a band-aid, I would support it. Fighting the fires in this manner, I would take, as I said, no political risk, and in any way the nation expects it, and this is the best current advice available to the Prime Minister. All right, now, However, while carrying on as usual, I would establish a small climate policy task force. This task force would be composed of 4 to 6 well-educated people, say a good liberal arts education, people with no expertise in policy making, no expertise in climate change, desertification, or agriculture. I would charge this task force with facilitating the development of a national policy to address the 3 greatest issues: desertification, megafires, and climate change, which are indivisible. A policy that addresses the cause, which is current management. Such statesmanship above politics, the nation would respect, I believe. There is, of course, no place for political ideology, nor any lobbyist, specialist ego, financial vested interest in such a policy. The policy that emerges will be based on addressing the full web of complexity in a national, holistic context. I would expect the task force to familiarise themselves with the holistic management policy analysis and development process, getting what assistance or training they need, and thereafter the task force would involve all of Australia's scientists and specialist experts in all fields in the development of any policy. The task force would not develop the policy, they would facilitate its development, making sure the knowledge of every scientist, economist, academic is brought to bear as the policy is developed by the nation. And I would anticipate the task force delivering the broad structure of a workable policy within about a year. Now that is not far-fetched, because almost all the knowledge you need is already in Australia, amongst your many experts in different fields, in your universities. Remember, reductionist policy development is the cause of climate change, not the lack of knowledge. I would expect the task force to deliver a policy that has full support, a policy foundation that has full support of all Australians, young and old. Policy that can then be fine-tuned, ready for adoption. This will require further time, obviously, because it could well run to several policies in agriculture, mining, finance, education, national parks, forestry, all of them coordinated under one umbrella climate policy. That is what I would do. Now, what is the risk in what I am suggesting? A policy task force running concurrently with government as usual. The downside risk is that no workable policy is developed and perhaps $500,000 is wasted. What is the upside of what I'm suggesting? Policy supported by the nation emerges and is adopted in due course, and the value simply cannot be measured. It is impossible to measure the value in any monetary form or in the millions of lives that will be saved by Australia being the first nation to begin seriously addressing the cause of climate change. Thank you for the honour of inviting me to present today's memorial lecture about the future of Australia and the world, and that I know Tony Coote had dreamed of when he established the Mulloon Institute. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allan. And to give a vote of thanks, I'd like to introduce the CEO of the Mulloon Institute, Carolyn Hall.
Thank you, Richard. The Mulloon Institute is very grateful to Allan Savory for delivering the 2020 Tony Coote Memorial Lecture. His work at the Africa Centre for Holistic Management empowers Zimbabwe's farmers to bring prosperity back to their land and communities, and he would value your support to continue this work. At the Mulloon Institute, our focus is on supporting Australian farmers, and part of this process involves the development of local and large-scale catchment rehydration projects across the nation. Our approach aims to create resilient, profitable and productive farms where agriculture, farmers and the environment work in unison. To find out more about how you can support the Institute or to partner with us, please visit our website. And thank you again for joining us this evening.